So this is equitable implementation and accountability, part one. What we're going to start talking about today is going to carry over into the next couple of meetings. So Wendy, would you like to go over the agenda and objectives?
Sure. Okay. As always, we've got our introduction. We will be settling in and going over ground rules. We're going to do some review and update on how we're using the impact maps that we worked on last meeting. Go over some key concepts on equitable implementation. What does that entail? What needs to go into the implementation framework? So we'll go over that. And then we've got our activity, which will take up the main portion of today's meeting, which is defining the implementation readiness, the partners, the next steps, and funding mechanisms. And then we'll do our conclusion, wrap up, and next steps on that. So the objectives for today are to start building out our equitable implementation and accountability framework for all of the strategies. And we have a lot of them in buildings and energy, so we've got a lot of work to do, but we're going to cover readiness of the strategy, the equitable next steps, who might be some potential implementation partners, and funding and financing. So the ground rules, as always, and our expectations are respect, RESPECT, be present, everyone participates, no one dominates, be additive, not repetitive, aim for consensus, things you can live with, be open to new ideas, bring solutions to problems, separate any people from problems, and then speak from your own experience. And we'll do the, well, we don't have Zoom reactions anymore, but we have some reactions here. So we'll follow that. And then the Elmo rule of enough, let's move on if we've taken up too much time on a topic, and just make space for others' opinions. So that's it.
Thanks, Wendy. And I think it's helpful to go back over these because when we start talking, brainstorming on these implementation next steps and, potential implementation partners, we really do want to be thinking about how to do this the right way and speaking from our own experience and just really respecting this new way of trying to do things the right way. So I know that it's repetitive to be going through these, but it's really important for the process. So today we are at the Creating Implementation Framework and Metrics. Following these series of meetings, we'll be further developing what's going to be hopefully adopted next spring. But just so you know, that community feedback and the engagement and all the work going on in terms of outreach is ongoing. Our office and all of our stakeholders are continually meeting and building those relationships. So engagement is an ongoing part of this entire process. So just to quickly review where we are, we've gone all the way through the goals and the vision, the priorities, the pathways, the objectives. We've prioritized those strategies back in May, and we went through the impact mapping at the last meeting to really understand how to make this equitable and resilient and identify those actions that will help us achieve our goals and leading us towards the indicators so we can measure success of these strategies. So now today we're talking about implementation, which is how are we going to equitably implement, measure progress, and ensure accountability in this plan. And as I said, that's going to kind of roll over the next couple of meetings. So just to revisit what we've done since the last meeting, when we went through the impacts, we asked what are the potential impacts of our prioritized strategies and how can those impacts inform the indicators that we're going to use to measure success. So if you'll remember, we spent a lot of time really thinking deeply about the outputs and outcomes of each of the strategies. And that's what's leading to the, what we're talking about today, which is then how are we going to identify those next steps that are equitable. And then in terms of the impacts, that'll lead to the next level of our implementation framework, which is accountability and transparency. So as you know, this whole process is very iterative. A lot of work is going on between the meetings to make sure that we're rolling in all of your great input and feedback into what's coming next. All right, so now I'm going to introduce the Equitable Implementation and Accountability Framework. It has lots of different elements to it. So what you see in green is the implementation side of the house, and the blue is the accountability side. So in terms of implementation, we're talking about funding and financing mechanisms, readiness, equitable next steps, implementation partners, and the city steward that's going to be responsible for helping to move the implementation forward. And then when we get to the accountability side, that's when we really think more deeply about transparency and external accountability, and what are the indicators and the costs and the timeline of each of these strategies. So today we're starting with the equitable implementation. The readiness that we'll be discussing is getting at what activities are already occurring and what might be needed to get this strategy off the ground. Then as we start thinking about those equitable next steps, that's what immediate next steps can we identify to equitably roll out this strategy. And we'll be, I'll be going back over this, but be thinking about, you know, we're not identifying all the steps necessary to complete each strategy. That would take us a long time, this small group. And it's not, there are a lot more people that should be part of that conversation. So because we are the ones, you are the ones who have developed these strategies, identified them as priorities, what do you see as brainstorm next steps to get it off the ground? And then we'll be thinking about those equity gaps and disparities that could be addressed with these strategies to make sure that it is equity centered. And then in terms of implementation partners, these are other, you know, what are departments or community organizations or private entities that could assist with the implementation? Who should be contacted, or just a brainstorm list of who should be included in the conversation. This isn't assigning tasks to anyone. This is really making sure that we're bringing the folks to the table who should be part of the solution. And then the funding and financing. What does financing look like for this type of strategy? We have a lot of great experts and stakeholders in the room with lots of experience. Where have you seen this work? What are some ways we can think about funding and financing? And again, that city steward is the city department that'll be responsible for overseeing the implementation of the strategy. So as we start to talk about those different elements of implementation, what we realized is we really need to go at the subcomponent level. So when we rolled up the strategies a couple meetings ago, we identified the ones that could be grouped, and we went through the impact mapping and saw where some of the strategies could be broken down into a couple of different components. We identified what we're calling the strategy. So for this example, the residential energy burden is implement measures to reduce the energy burden of Richmond's most vulnerable communities and improve residential resilience to climate change. And then the subcomponents that rolled up under there are about facilitating energy efficiency upgrades, establishing partnerships to provide equitable thermal comfort, and then educate all residents about the benefits of electrification. So that is where that strategy, that's how it's broken down in the work that we're going to develop today. So that's what we're calling the subcomponents of the strategies. In terms of readiness for each of those subcomponents, it's what's the status of it. So that's where we want to ask, you know, what's the most appropriate readiness category for it, and is there something missing that we might want to identify to make sure that it is ready. So if it's ongoing or already underway, Maybe implementation for that strategy has already started. You're aware that it's already underway. We want to identify that. If it's ready to go, then we want to note that. If it's aligned for implementation in another plan, maybe another department has got it put, that you're aware of another department or agency or organization that has started that, we want to make note of it there. Requires city action. That means, is there some kind of a law or zoning or regulation or policy or ordinance that needs to be passed in order for us to move forward on that strategy? And then the final category is requires state action. So are there policy changes at the state level that are needed in order for us to move forward on that strategy? So that's the first question we'll be asking when we go into our breakout, is what is the readiness level status of that subcomponent? In terms of equitable next steps, this is the one that's gonna take the most brain power and the most conversation to really brainstorm what are the equitable next steps to help determine how and where the strategy is implemented. So there's a link to the chat to the equity screening tool. It's the 3-page document that was developed about 6 months ago. You guys were part of that development. Our roundtable finalized it, and so it asks some really good questions about the community priorities that'll help us think about those equity gaps and disparities that could be addressed through this strategy. So the first question is, what are 1 to 3 key next steps that we can take to equitably implement this strategy? And then once you think about those next steps, what are the major equity gaps that the strategy could address? And then once you identify those gaps, we want to capture how can we equitably prioritize the rollout of this strategy. And we'll be walking through one together so you can get a better sense of what all of that means. But certainly want to reorient you to that tool if that's helpful to you. And then the other part of the conversation that's really important are these implementation partners. Those are the ones that can assist with successfully implementing a strategy. And again, this doesn't mean that we're publishing some list of, who we think needs to go out and make this happen. It's really just a list of who we think should be involved in potentially involved in the conversation in order for it to be successful. Who should be invited? Who should be asked? Who could benefit from the success of the action is important. And then what frontline or historically underrepresented community members or organizations should we include? So, it's just identifying potential stakeholders that we should connect with. Again, like I said, it's a brainstorming of potential inclusion, is no way tapping people for involvement. It's just the beginning of our implementation journey. So no one's being assigned, nothing is going to be published without reaching out to them as potential partners. We just want to make sure we're being inclusive so we can really set ourselves up for success. So think about who's essential to the decision-making process. And who do we want to be part of the conversation? Are there any questions about that before I move on?
Could I ask real quick, so do you want us to be specific about organizations? Like, would we say home, or would we say housing advocacy organizations?
Housing advocacy organizations will be great. And if you know of specific ones in specific neighborhoods, if you have it at that level, that's great too. This is really just a brainstorm to capture, the expertise, because there are lots of conversations that go on all the time about this, but it's not necessarily being captured anywhere. And we have, dozens of strategies and thousands of conversations going on about this, but it's time to start, capturing that level of detail so we can be successful.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and then the last step of this is the funding and financing mechanisms and pathway maps. So pathway maps, this is an example of one for buildings and energy. And it's just a visual communication tool that shows some of the different pathways for climate action plans that was developed by several cities through USDN. And so in this example, we have a couple of key initiatives. We have municipal building energy efficiency retrofits and establishing a CPACE program. And so some of the different financial mechanisms could be grants or identifying partners or loans or bonds, might be city budget. So we want to capture that. If you're familiar with this, if this is something that you have an area of expertise in, or you've heard of it working somewhere else, we want to capture that bit of information here. Again, this is really just the beginning of our implementation journey. We want to come up with some kind of a tool to help those who will be working on these strategies so that they can investigate further some different options. So this is just an example that was put together showing some of the resources or partners that exist out there. It's not exhaustive. It's just a list of ones that were identified, and then some case examples of other cities and counties that have successfully used those types of resources or partners. So this will be really helpful to start capturing that level of information from you folks. We'll be building this for all of our strategies, and they're complicated. So for those of you who like this type of work, we're looking for volunteers to help us build this out. Like I said, we're creating the frameworks for them, but to start adding in the examples and the content, we would love for some volunteers to help with this. So any questions on that before I move on? Okay. Again, here's a little bit more on the funding and financing mechanisms, the types and definitions, if that helps kind of spur some thoughts. But those questions we'll be asking are, will this strategy be supported by municipal budgeting? If so, how? What grants, partnerships, or other funding sources are you aware of? Are there any existing local programs that could be aligned with or expanded upon? And what are some examples of similar, what are some successful similar funding examples? So the transition to a net zero resilient Richmond cannot be funded entirely by local property taxpayers. So we really need to identify creative and innovative approaches and strategic investments by both the public and private sectors. And this is where we can start capturing some of those types. So our activity, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce you to it, and we're gonna walk through one together, and then we will go into just two different breakout groups. So we have a nice group of folks to add to the conversation in each group, but it is going to be a little more slow moving. So we want to make sure that everyone understands what this activity involves so that we can stay focused on what we're trying to accomplish today. We'll be going into the breakouts hopefully about 40 minutes per strategy, but it's really just up to the facilitators to keep an eye on the clock and keep the conversation moving so we can get through as many as we can. And then this will continue on into the next meeting to get through the rest of the strategies. So like I said, the first question is about readiness. So what activities are already occurring and what is the subcomponent's general readiness for implementation? And then secondly, we'll be going through what are 1 to 3 key next steps, taking equity into consideration, and in order to get the strategy off the ground. And then who can assist with implementing the subcomponent to carry out those next steps? That's the partners question. And then again, what does financing look like? Some of those specific sources of funds or general funding strategies. What does it look like for that type of activity? Excuse me. All right, so the activity itself is a Google Sheet, and we're going to walk through one together. As the note takers, I'm going to ask Wendy, David, and and myself will be kind of trying to capture your comments in a big group. So this is really just practice. We're all going to walk through it together, but I'm going to pull up my sheet so that you can see what it looks like. Okay, so can you all see my screen? It's probably kind of small. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger here. Okay, so for this first subcomponent of our first objective, it is convert all city-owned streetlights to LED lighting, minimize operation, looks like a spelling there, during daylight hours, and identify opportunities for solar panels in the lighting infrastructure, prioritize improvements in historically disenfranchised neighborhoods. So that's about municipal street lighting upgrades. And some of the notes that we carried along, we put in this column C. That's from previous working group meetings, from the community engagement period, some of the staff comments last March when it went out to all the other city departments. We captured that here so that we wouldn't lose it. And some of the comments we kind of carried along. Someone said integrate dark sky criteria through recommendations from the Dark Skies Association. For example, integrate hooded fixtures to direct light downwards and use motion activated dimming to reduce light pollution. So that was a comment from Conveo. In some cases, you're going to see source impact mapping. So that was identified last meeting, and we wanted to make sure we brought that recommendation along. And in other cases, you'll see source working group or staff feedback. The other column that we've kind of pre-populated is under relevant legislation. This one doesn't have any that was identified, but if there is something that our staff has thought might be helpful to consider, we put that in column I. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, in terms of converting all city-owned streetlights to LED lighting, is it ongoing, ready to go, aligned, city action, or state action? Feel free to call it out. What do you think? Okay, well, I'm not going to take up your time because it's ongoing. That's already happening. We know that's happening. It's in the works. Not every single part of this subcomponent, but in terms of converting city-owned streetlights to LED, it is ongoing. So then, in terms of potential next steps for addressing this strategy, what would you say are 1 to 3 key next steps?
Keep doing it.
I know they're focusing on South Side, but I don't know if they have a second and a third focus. So using equity as a lens to determine where that's going to happen in bulk next, maybe.
Yes. Okay, so this is the hard conversation. It's happening, but where is it happening? How fast is it happening? You know, what does that plan really look like? Is it incorporating all these details that we've identified as important? So I think I would say the first point is something about, you know, if we're trying, say some task force takes on this this example or this subcomponent, they need to understand what the existing plan is, right? Where are the streetlights going in? Have they already determined the rollout plan? I think getting a sense of what's going on is the first step. And then if we want to identify what are the major equity gaps or disparities that it could address, it's what Jeff was just saying about, Jeff, say it again, on South Side.
I think when the mayor announced that plan, it was kind of focused on South Side, but the question is, where is the next neighborhood through an equity lens, or the next area of the city? It's ongoing. I don't know if it has a secondary and tertiary target, you know.
Perfect. Yep. So that would be a great, you know, what is the disparity that it could address? There are areas of town that They have poor lighting, and as we know, poor lighting leads to increased crime and property values and all kinds of other equity considerations. So we want to make sure that we are identifying those. And then in terms of how can we equitably roll out, let me keep moving over here so you can see. How can we equitably prioritize the rollout of this strategy? Well, what would be a suggestion there? Anyone have any ideas? Maybe it has to do with getting a sense of the poorly lit neighborhoods and using the climate equity lens. Maybe we would look at formerly redlined neighborhoods first. Maybe we would look at high crime areas, or be thinking about how could we equitably prioritize the rollout of this strategy. Something else that I think helps us thinking in that direction, and it might in some cases be helpful to start with the potential implementation partners first. So what city departments should we include? So here for equitably prioritize, I would say climate equity index and formerly redlined neighborhoods.
Could just be a map of property values.
Okay. Great. Just a brainstorm. This is nothing that's set in stone. This is really just gathering your thoughts. So in terms of potential implementation partners, city departments, obviously DPU street lighting, right? Who else?
Citizen service and response.
Okay, I'm going to ask Wendy or David to type that in while I try to keep us moving here. And then maybe it's we're talking about the dark skies, and that's more like site plan review kind of stuff, right? So maybe planning and development. Okay, so for community organizations, maybe how about civic associations? Who else would help with the rollout of this in an equitable way? Private sector dominion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And another, I was thinking with this one, maybe we include the police department. Where do they see poorly lit neighborhoods and have, high crime partly resulting from poorly lit areas? So maybe police would be involved. Maybe we could ask volunteers to drive around and do a survey of what they see as poorly lit neighborhoods, or even outages. Some places have outages and they're reported, and there's a slow response time. These are just different things that happen all over the world. And then maybe there are even maybe think even further, maybe there's some schools who could get involved, or some student organizations. Think outside the box. This is not necessarily how things have been done in the past, but what are some suggestions on how we could potentially do things better going forward? And then the reason we have another column called equity partners is because that's really trying to, community organizations. Just because we identified civic associations, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're really thinking outside the box when it comes to equity. So that's just kind of another opportunity to consider what are some equity partners that we could involve in this that could help us get at those equity gaps. All right, so did that make sense? Any other questions or comments on that one? So then we would move into potential funding and financing mechanisms. And the first question we'll want to ask is it capital intensive or programmatic? Now this one, LED lights, that's pretty capital intensive. So if it's capital intensive, we'll put a CI. If it's programmatic, that's things like, does it require staff time, maybe some outreach and education, maybe some policy initiatives, things that could be prioritized in-house with not requiring a whole lot of dedicated funding. So then what does creative and strategic financing for this look like? So right now, the LED street lighting that's happening, it's municipal budgeting. And so it's only going to be done, you know, going through those protocols as budgets allow. Well, maybe we can think a little bit outside the box. Are there any grants or partnerships or other funding sources that we could reach out to help move this forward a little faster and equitably? And then, are there any existing local programs that could be aligned with this or expanded? Are there any, you know, programs going on that have to do with LED lighting? C-Power rebates, that's a good example. And then what are some successful similar funding examples that you guys know of? Okay, so I hope I've gotten some wheels churning. This is what we're going to be doing in our breakouts. We're going to split into two. We have a lot of folks here today, which is fantastic. In which case, I don't know if it might even make sense to go into 3 groups. What do folks think? Should we do 2 or 3? What do you think, Wendy?
I'm looking, I'm looking at the list to see how many of them are our staff. I think we'll be okay with 2.
Okay, we'll try 2. And we'll see how it goes. And then for the next meeting, we might split into 3. All right, so any other questions about this activity before we change it up? So we're going to give you a chance to decide if you want to go into one or the other. Otherwise, we'll just divide you up evenly. I'm going to keep a group that's going over objective 1. That's the municipal objective about achieving climate neutrality and increased resilience in government buildings, infrastructure, and operations. And then Wendy and David are going to be facilitating the breakout group that's going to talk about maximize energy efficiency, performance, and resilience in all existing buildings. So we're going to go into a break and come back at 11:40. And Wendy, if you want to help get folks signed up, I'll start assigning the breakouts.
Anyway, if anyone has a preference and is unable to put it on the Google slide, just let me know and I'll assign you. And if you're not signed up for either, then we'll either assume you're fine with either breakout group, put you in accordingly. Or else, let me know.
Okay, so I think I have the rooms set up. If I am sending you to a room, then you're gonna be teleported with Wendy and Wendy and David, and it does take like a minute to land there. So I'll go ahead and get that started, and then if you're not, you're gonna stay with me. Okay, here we go. And if at any point you want to come back into the main room and help us, or you need to ask me a question, in the top right corner, there's a button that says, I think it says return to main room. And that's how you do that. And so otherwise, we will all come back to we're going to get through as many subcomponents we can. I'm with objective 1, Wendy and David are on objective 2, and we'll come back together at 12:50. So we have an hour and 10 minutes. Okay, here we go.
Here we go.
All right, it says it's still opening, so if someone disappears, that's where they're going. But I think we're left with, so Jeanette from schools and Jeff from city finance. We have Michael Donnenberg, our expert health and hospital and physical space expert, and then Kendra Norell, our communications and engagement coordinator, Adam Hull from city government, Jessica Green from Virginia Energy Efficiency Council, Bob Stone, city engineer, and then Alexis Laundry is our summer intern with University of Richmond Law School. So I think we have some great folks here to help us build these strategies out. And like I said, this is all hands on deck. So please call out any suggestions that you have, and I'll do my best to capture them. And Alexis, do you have access to this spreadsheet? Because maybe you could help me take notes since I see you in here too.
Yes, I do. Sure.
Okay, thanks. So with this first one about LED lighting, since we've already walked through it together, has anyone thought of anything else you'd like me to add to this before we move on? I think maybe understanding the existing plan is important, but then also some kind of status on current lighting levels. in neighborhoods would be a next step.
An existing conditions report would be a cool place to start.
Yep.
One other thought, just looking over the equity agenda again, maybe communicating with the communities that are going to be recipients of this, just to make sure that their feedback is being gathered and at the very least they're aware of it.
Love it. Perfect. Okay, so then the second one, there's some feedback. I don't know if it's me. Don't want to put the sound to be goofy for you. So the second one is benchmark energy use in all city buildings. Set a goal to meet Energy Star certification guidelines, improve building energy use, and make information available in a public portal. Ongoing, ready to go. So
I'd assume it's ongoing.
it's
Yeah, I
on.
would think to some extent it's ongoing with the work you're doing with the, what's the,
Energy cap.
yeah, energy cap. Yeah.
We do have energy cap tracking, and we have all of our buildings also being tracked in Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So it's ongoing, but it's not perfect. It has a lot of room for improvement. So improving building energy use and making information available in a public portal, those need to be done better. You know, like we need to come up with some kind of implementation plan. Like we're tracking and we're incorporating as much of this reporting into our decision making, but we need to come up with a plan to integrate it better. So what do y'all think in terms, if we had to identify 1 to 3 next steps, continue energy cap tracking. And Adam, maybe you can speak to at least the facilities dashboard. Are there any talks about making that public in any way?
That has come up, in trying to figure out what format would be the most useful for consumers of that information. I guess on that note, and also related to energy cap, I wonder if there's any benefit in doing a gap analysis of what information or data are currently being tracked and recorded versus what we want to be tracking and recording, either for Energy Star certification or for public consumption. Can start there.
Great. Okay, so let's think in terms of equity. What are the major equity gaps or disparities that this strategy could address? So we're talking about all city buildings. Are there community centers or should we start with certain?
Well, I think for start, you got to kind of compare like facilities to like facilities. I mean, so, looking at, say, branch libraries, as a group, or police precincts or fire stations against fire stations. I mean, trying to compare a branch library to a water pump station,
Right.
Is not a apples to apples comparison, nor is looking at a building like the main library the same as looking at a branch library. So. And then maybe you start to see where that leads you.
What are the equity gaps? If you look
And
at
then,
your,
and then compare those to maybe, national benchmarks or whatever. But
okay. So in terms of equity gaps, if you looked at the equity screening tool, certainly transparency, government accountability is a big one. You know, these taxpayer dollars paying for a lot of energy. So getting some kind of the public portal together. This is a tough one though, because it's city buildings. It's not so
Right.
much helping our community. So unless you guys can think of something, I guess prioritizing the buildings. I don't
I
know.
think you could talk about prioritizing buildings that folks are actually in, like Mr. Stone recently said. That's great if the 10th floor of City Hall is run efficiently and is thermally conductive to doing business, but we need to look at buildings that our residents are using first, as far as community centers, libraries, schools, things that they are in may take a precedent over, buildings that those of us here regularly are working in.
Mm-hmm.
it may point you to facilities that haven't been maybe adequately maintained or reinvested in. Again, if you're looking at, libraries or community centers, you might find that maybe energy usage per square foot at one branch library is significantly higher than the norm, that may be reflective of a lack of investment. Or
Great. Okay. Any other thoughts on next steps for this one? How
I
about,
think for all of these, it's just overlay spatial data socially that you don't think of in the context of buildings, but really frames the conversation in equity.
say that one more time, overlay spatial data publicly?
Social spatial data that kind of informs, like, once again, like Rob was talking about, okay, this library seems to be one of the lower performers. Can we put a equity frame on why that might be? Is it a lower income area, to tell that story instead of just saying we're going to fix the lowest performers first? That might not have an equity lens.
Yep. Perfect. Okay. How about potential implementation partners? Who could we ask to help with this? So city departments, certainly it's DPW facilities.
It sounds like sustainability is already doing some of this, so they should probably be on there.
Sam Schwarzkopf at OPS for public outreach. And DIT probably.
And then the DIT is the portal side of it.
And I think, not to add a whole laundry list, but even just a general, any agencies or departments that are managing or responsible for city facilities, they need to be involved in some of that benchmarking.
So what do we call them? Like building coordinators?
Facility managers, I
Ten,
don't know.
building tenants, I don't know.
Okay. How about community organizations? Actually, I'm thinking schools. When we say city departments, we're specifically City of Richmond departments, but other organizations would be other agencies. So I think partnering with schools to know what they're doing, because we don't really line up our programs very well from what I've seen.
So you must mean public schools, I guess.
Yeah, talking about Richmond Public Schools. Any other thoughts on other community organizations? How about private sector?
Yeah, private sector or benchmarking against if the state has similar building efficiency managing measures.
Mm,
The competition, is tough, but is good.
Healthy competition.
yep. And equity partners, can you think of any organizations that would like to be part of this?
Well, I mean, there are, I guess, firms that are under like state contracts to do energy efficiency contracting, that sometimes they come in and do that in terms of, I guess they've got various ways of, I guess, making money out of implementing
ESCOs.
energy efficiency upgrades for buildings.
ESCOs.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I think if we're talking about this in a geographic sense, I think any neighborhood organization, if you show, hey, you guys have low performing energy efficiency in your library or in your school, are all of a sudden going to be very involved in that, or I would hope so.
From an education perspective. Yeah, this is all about leading by example.
Yeah, conversely, you may look at the data and find that a given facility uses a lot less energy or electricity than its peers. And, in some cases you might find that that's because some systems or whatever haven't been working in a while. And, while it's saving energy, it's affecting occupant health and comfort.
So are you suggesting another step or partner that I should count?
Not necessarily, just I guess, you might, by looking at the data, you might see things that otherwise might slip, go under the radar.
At schools, we use a module called Utility Direct by School Dude. It's really for, public schools. And I enter all of the utility data into this huge database. And when we run the usage reports, we can identify, whether it be water consumption, excessive water use, and so forth. And that really does help us identify something nobody would have, necessarily seen, leaks in the building and this and that. So it's very helpful.
Okay, great.
I mean,
So-
similar to when we were looking at the data, Dawn, and you saw that, Columbus Pump Station is, had a pretty significant decrease in energy consumption over the last year. And, when we discussed, it's because we've had equipment issues there. We've been sort of underutilizing that facility and using a companion facility in its place. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Can't manage what you can't measure.
yeah.
So capital intensive or programmatic? This one is mostly programmatic, I think. But there might be some capital involved in the improving building use and the public portal. Can you think of any sources of funding that could help with that? I think the ESCOs.
This
I
is
don't want to
specific
just
to-
throw ARPA money around, but I mean, I think a lot of these ARPA money is a potential source of funding.
What is it?
American Rescue Plan Act money.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, especially as it relates to capital infrastructure and to environmental aspects.
Okay. Okay, let's jump down to the next one, which is prioritize energy efficiency retrofits of city buildings and those that serve the public, therefore improving their health, safety, and accessibility while rating the highest return on investment in cost savings and greenhouse gas reductions. We got at that a little bit when we were talking about benchmarking. Can you think of, well, let's see, let's look at the notes and legislation. So incorporate measures from House Bill 2001 and write a policy outlining those requirements. That is in the works. We have an intern who's helping us with that this summer. So we certainly need everyone to help push that through, right? Prioritize buildings with the highest energy burden, ones that serve the public, have the highest ROI and greatest reductions. And then track the number of buildings retrofitted and publish energy savings, consider school tracking and publicity, Center for Green Schools and EPA IAQ tools for schools programs. So those sound like a lot of good partners and next steps. In terms of relevant legislation, the House Bill 2001 requires new buildings greater than 5,000 square feet in size, or the renovation of a building where the cost exceeds 50% of the value, that it has sufficient electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and it has utility tracking, and some green building certification requirements. So with all that said, what do you see as 1 to 3 key next steps to get this one off the ground?
Do we do a readiness status for this one?
What does that look like to you? Readiness of the buildings, come up with like a, how do we decide? Because we see lots of like prioritized buildings with this and that, but maybe there needs to be some specific rating system. Is that what you're getting at?
Like a standardized scorecard?
Oh, you're asking about readiness and status. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I jumped the gun.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd call it ongoing yet, or maybe not even, maybe aligned, or at best ready to go, but.
Prioritize energy efficiency retrofits of the city buildings. Yeah, I think ready to go. It's not really in a plan yet, is it?
If it's not in a plan, is it ready to go?
Well,
like aligned.
it's ready to go as in we want to get it in this plan. You know, if it's already in Richmond 300 or some other, transportation plan or water plan, then that's what aligned means. But ready to go means with this plan, we're ready to implement it.
Wow. I'd push back. I think that I'd put that under city action because we could make all the standardized scorecards we want. We can do all the policies and ordinances as a department, but if we don't have motion from elected officials saying that this is a priority, then nothing gets funded, you know? So I think it really has to be something that requires city action to align with the state regulation to fund these projects. It's ready to go on paper, but until something gets money, it's just spinning its wheels.
Perfect. Yep, you're right. You're both right. Okay, so then we get the ordinance, and we have a scorecard, and then what are the equity gaps on this one? Similar to the benchmarking?
Yeah, I think it's similar.
Okay, then in terms of equitably prioritizing, Adam, on the facilities dashboard that is kind of in the works, what are some of the conversations about prioritizing retrofits?
I think a lot of that is ongoing. I don't know that there's been a standardization in terms of being able to do that. So maybe that's something that belongs here.
We have a standardized scorecard and then some kind of like prioritization.
Yeah, the dashboard in its current sort of prototype form doesn't really do any sort of prioritization. It's really just presenting the information that we have. It's any prioritization or decision making would need to be done looking at that data, but the tool itself doesn't do that for you.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yep, that does. So then how can we be equitable in that standard as that scorecard and in the protocol for decision making? And even in drafting the ordinance.
Like, what's that KPI of the thing that is it resident served? Is it, and this is just asking questions, not providing solutions, but somewhere out there is that thing that we can say politically, this is what we care about. This is what levels things to allow us to make informed decisions. I don't know what that is.
Exactly. What are some ideas? I mean, I think we said serve the public. You know, if there are certain neighborhoods with poor air quality.
I know
I don't know if there's. Go ahead, Jeff.
No, you're going ahead.
I was just gonna looking back at the subcomponent itself for this one. I don't know if there's anything additional that could be gleaned out of the improving health, safety, and accessibility in specific metrics that would inform those pieces. So I'm sure that there's some. I don't know if we thought about that when we were writing the subcomponents, but I'm sure there's some data that may be able to inform those items.
So if you have any ideas, throw them out. Otherwise, we'll have to keep thinking about it.
I'd like to stay away from participatory budgeting for prioritizing things like this. because the people that can participate in that kind of budgeting are people who have ways and means to have childcare and have the time to participate. So I'm concerned it's a little inherently inequitable.
I mean, in terms of accessibility, I don't think we have anyone on from the Office of Equitable Mobility, but they may have standardized metrics that they use to rate a neighborhood or an area that could be used as part of this.
Great.
I don't know.
Yeah, great. Thank you. All right, so back onto the partners then. City departments.
I think Adam just mentioned one that would be beneficial is Office of Equitable Mobility.
Any other partners?
I think budget and finance. Probably DPW facilities.
I mean, in reality, I think anybody who is inhabiting a capital project from a city perspective has a stake in that. Everyone wants a new office. Not everyone, but you know.
Any community organizations? Do we have organizations that use our public buildings that could be invited to the conversation?
Any library or community center with a multi-purpose space, but that might be getting granular.
Any private sector or equity partners on this one?
Seems similar to the prior one.
Right now we're getting rebates back through the state and C-Power, so that's important. How about funding for retrofits?
There are periodically grant programs that includes special set-asides for energy efficiency type retrofits.
Okay.
And I think there's also, you know, financing opportunities that the city has not taken yet as far as loans go, but in the current rate environment, it's not worth the savings for the administrative overhead. In the future, it certainly might be. There's a lot of reporting a lot of regular updates that are tied to those, different loans.
Yeah, and a lot of it, if it has federal money, a lot of that carries Davis-Bacon, which has a pretty heavy administrative burden. And, the American iron and steel requirements, which could be a cost driver.
Could delete any savings that you have in the lower rate by having to purchase higher expense material.
Yeah, I mean, Davis-Bacon, you got to get weekly payroll reports from your prime contractor and all their subcontractors, and then you're subject to an annual federal single audit. Yeah.
Okay, I'll pay the geo bond rates instead. That's kind of what happens.
So any other partnerships or special funding sources that you're aware of? Okay, so this next one, create an energy manager position with authority to work across departments and establish partnerships in the community. Would be helpful for integrating future legislative and technology impacts and tying energy goals to funding and compensation. Provide formal assessments of agenda items from the Planning Commission, EDA, DPW, and procurement to include economic development projects and public buildings so that they're all energy positive. These were suggestions that came back. What do you think? Ongoing, ready to go, aligned, city action or state action?
Wouldn't the city have to approve that position?
Yep. All right, so then what are the next steps to make that happen?
Determine whose budget that would fall under. With all of those different departments, I'd love for that to be in the Office of Sustainability or, but my question is, at some point, is that a position of the CAO's office or something like that so that they can effectively work, but I don't know.
Okay. Any other next steps that we'd want to capture in order to make this effective? How about equity gaps that this strategy could address?
I'd like to think whoever we hired would, in the interview, tell us about all the equity gaps that they would identify. It's kind of a self. If they're good, they're going to tell us, is what I hope.
Mm. And so then how can we equitably prioritize this rollout? I think, interview the candidate.
I don't know, if we were interviewing the candidate, there'd probably be a discussion, right? We know about lots of equity gaps across the community, so you can almost just kind of skirt this box by saying every equity gap could be addressed by this, interdepartmental energy manager.
Great. All right, then who should the partners be to help develop this job description and interview questions?
think this is regular suspects of who you have listed for the prior ones, right? As far as DPU, I mean, I think you list where they cross departments in the description. I think that's a pretty good listing of who would have some say there.
All right, any community organizations that we'd want to include in this process? Private sector? I think the different boards and commissions that touch. Equity partners, how about from the community? If part of this job is, legislation, EDA, economic development projects, public buildings. Can we think of groups, like are there other organizations in the community that might want to work closely with this person?
I think like non-departmental expenditures, like if you would want to include public transit organizations and things like that, who we can leverage having one central one for Richmond. Maybe the bus system would be interested. Maybe Jeanette, RPS would be interested in providing the data to a central place. So those might be community organizations that would have interest.
Yeah,
True.
great.
True.
Yeah, I would think another community organization, I don't know whether you call them community, but VEPCA would be.
Yep. Great. How about creative funding for this position? Any thoughts?
There are grant funded positions, of course, but I don't know.
I mean, I would think, potentially the DPU as a significant, one of the city's major energy consumers could partially fund the position or whatever, just as we partially fund some procurement and other sort of general fund functions.
Robert makes a good point. This could be, hey, everybody's going to pitch in a little bit for this cross-functional role, as opposed to we need to find X grand a year where it goes into one place.
Strictly out of general fund, yeah.
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Great. Okay, well, so that's strategy 1. Number 2 is municipal clean energy and net zero construction. Incorporate measures toward the goal of converting all city buildings to clean energy by 2050. So the first subcomponent, incorporate electrification requirements into all capital improvement plans. Is this ongoing, ready to go, aligned, needs city action, state action? What do you think?
Code, probably. Code requirements.
Okay, so that's the first thing that needs to happen. What else needs to happen?
Um,
I mean, I still find this one a little bit challenging in terms of the electrification. I mean, both from, I guess, putting on a DPU hat that we operate a gas utility but just, in general, building some of the most efficient space heating is natural gas fired boiler based. So I'm not sure how electrification fits in there, but
Yes, so that's
typically gas fired hot water heaters are more energy efficient than electric hot water heaters. So
so that is a great point, because that's kind of the elephant in the room that, while fossil fuels are not great for our greenhouse gas inventory, we're not there yet as a city. We own a natural gas utility. So probably the first question is, we really do need to figure out what the future of the gas utility looks like, right?
yeah, and then what's the state of I guess the HVAC mechanical industry? I don't know that they're really there yet either, but.
Okay, so then the major equity gaps or disparities that this strategy could address, maybe it's a jobs, workforce development. I don't know. Thoughts?
training, educational training.
Yeah, and just education in general, actually.
And I mean, swam contractors, things of that nature.
All right, so how about partners? Certainly it's gonna be contractors, HVAC. What other organizations?
Budget.
In terms of the training and workforce development, can you think of organizations that are there, trade schools or who would we want to reach out to for workforce development as it relates to electrification? I'm just making stuff up here, so if you guys have anything, please let me know. Actually, for CIP, it's our CIP engineers, right?
Yeah, I think just broadly, it would be good to include any of the city's project managers, which I think are concentrated in DPW, DPU, and parks, but they'd be the ones that would be driving a lot of this.
Okay, great. Any creative funding or financing mechanisms for this? Jessica, I'm going to call on you if you're there. You might be doing a million different things, but any ideas from like VAEEC, experience or perspective on electrification and funding and financing?
Yeah, I was actually kind of racking my brain there. And I'm sorry, I'm also kind of double dutying on childcare right now, so I'm not completely present. But that is something we've been starting to dive into. ACEEE has been a pretty good resource for us. American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy.
Great. Yeah, that's a good one. And then in terms of the education piece, I'm going to put USDN because we get a lot of great information from them regarding electrification and other cities that are much further along. All right, we'll be thinking about it if you have any other ideas. Catalog and track natural gas usage of all city buildings. So this is being done in Energy Cap.
Mhm.
Get back to that readiness. I think I would say a next step would be, it's kind of what Bob was getting at, like the building use and maybe BTUs per square foot, some kind of establish a measurement.
Is this with the intention that it would be put into this same public data portal as the previous recommendation, or like what's the purpose of measurement, I guess is what my question is.
Yeah, good question. I think it determine how this is, it's part of measuring. You can't manage what you can't measure, but it's determine how this will be used strategically, right?
Because this one gets into the fact that, natural gas bad, also Richmond natural gas salesman is, and that's something that as a larger conversation we need to rectify.
Sure, but
Is there a reason that
coming up again, but it's not something we should run away from either.
Exactly.
This is 2050 is a long time away. We gotta ditch that. And the earlier point about in some cases gas is more efficient. Yeah, are we also measuring all the harms and measuring all the costs of all the harms? So, and meanwhile, the efficiency is improving. So in our plan, gas has no place in our plan. Even if it has a place, in 2021, it has no place in our plan.
Great.
But there's a point where those two lines intersect, as you're saying, in the long term, and I think identifying when electric efficiency outpaces the externalities of the gas is we're not going to answer that right now, but that's the question that we really need to be asking is when do those lines cross?
Okay, so the major equity gaps that this strategy could address.
Well, there are the health equities of inequities of the pollution.
So then how would we equitably prioritize the rollout of that?
That column is, kind of funny when it comes to some of the things we're considering because these are more global and not necessarily
City buildings.
I mean, if we track natural gas in all buildings, including ones that are in, traditionally, red line districts or whatever, it sort of infers that it implies that they suffer more from what happens locally, and I don't know. That's true.
Yeah, no, you're right. There's not a direct connection to that. I think it's more of the lead by example. If we can educate, say we go to a library in a formerly red line neighborhood and then have some education programs and some sponsors there who can have incentives for electrification in their home, and there are some public health issues related to using natural gas in your home, and I think there's an education piece here.
Yeah, it ties in with community efforts. The city efforts are can be examples for the community efforts. I think that's a good point. But here we're dealing with the city buildings, so. But they serve as an example.
Okay. All right, so partners then for natural gas tracking. You think of anyone outside of the city? Are there any funding sources we want to capture?
Well, is there a partner that who has a great way to track their city's natural gas usage we can borrow or something? Does that fit in this section?
Yes. I'm going to actually put that as a next step.
Okay.
Your energy cap, I think, is tracking natural gas bills and usage for city facilities, isn't it, Dawn?
Yes. Yeah, so it's really more about, like I said, establish a tracking system that looks at building usage type. Energy cap has I can tell you right now which buildings are using what amount of natural gas per square foot, but I can't tell you exactly what it's being used for or some different components. There's a lot that you can do with energy cap that's not being done because we don't have an energy manager with dedicated time to do that. So it's really just, building out the program. Okay.
It's typically it's used for space heating and it's used for domestic hot water. I mean, it's the two principal uses in a building.
But then what that building type is, we don't have every building with a division associated with it, a department or division. So there's just some tracking that needs to happen.
What you're saying is we have the system, but we need more people to be analyzing it in more depth.
Yep.
we need non-utility data being applied to the utility data so we can sort, filter, and assess.
Yep. Okay, require green building standards in all new construction and incorporate the infrastructure required to make them solar ready, wired for EV chargers, and compatible for demand response enrollment. So this gets at the new House bill. And our office is working on a draft policy for this right now. It would need to be, approved, but this is something that's in the works. So I'm gonna say ongoing, but we certainly need to get it approved, or it requires city action, I guess. I'm gonna do both of those.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh.
What?
A new twist.
That's a good way to
Choosing
do
two
that.
of
That's
these.
a good way to do that.
We're working, we have a draft based on the new House bill, but it needs to be, someone needs to say, yes, we're doing this,
Yeah, this is big. This is a big deal.
So Don, give us a little bit of insight if you can. Is there what I think one of the first action steps in that is, what is the standard? Is there an existing certification, or are we creating our own standard that aligns to the House bill?
aligns with the House bill. So currently we have a sustainable building policy that does require a LEED Silver certification, right, Bob, on buildings over, is it 5,000 or 10,000?
Yeah, somewhere in that threshold.
Yeah. So this, to align our existing policy with House Bill 2001 and these extra requirements, it just needs more teeth in it.
Yes, and council by their own resolution is long overdue for a reevaluation of that policy resolution. So,
Yep.
That one that's been continued for quite a long time, as I recall, or?
yeah, and then like I say, yeah, the LEED's program standards have undergone a significant, I guess. Yeah, so certified is probably what silver was when they passed that resolution, and what would have been silver then would, so it's a little more onerous now than it was then. But,
Mhm.
and there's probably some, competing programs now that maybe weren't as fully developed as they were. How old's that thing now? Probably 6, 7 years old, I think, since they last looked at it. But
Okay. Can you think of equity gaps that this strategy could address? Maybe it has something to do with the contractors involved. I don't know.
Well, does the city already have a procedure for, minority-owned businesses and things like that?
Yep.
So it seems like, it'll just align with that. Is that what you meant, Don?
Yeah.
I
Anyone
think
here
the
has?
issue that we run into that a lot is that we have the best intentions of using those private entities, but there's a lot of gap in the work needed to be done and certified, and we use SWAM just as a generality versus minority, but so I think having workforce development is critical to that, to try to fill that gap of having more SWAM businesses that can do this work.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
yeah, I know in building the last schools, there were a lot of trade packages that were bid that there wasn't any minority contractors competing for the work. I mean,
Right. Yeah, we run into that quite a bit.
And I won't be specific as to, but it was once previously said, laying concrete is laying concrete. We should be able to find a minority vendor for these services. That's a gross oversimplification of the construction process. I mean, there's nuance to all of these contractors that, you know, I think we can work with the state, because I think the state runs into similar issues as well.
Any implementation partners we want to include in this? Green building standards?
USGBC themselves, potentially.
Yep. We just have about 5 more minutes, so I'd love to get through this strategy. Green building standards, new construction, city buildings. Private sector, equity partners. I think it's a lot of the same, right? Okay. Any other funding or financing? Creative ways to get this done outside of city budgets?
There should be federal funds that,
They should be.
you know, to apply for. Again, way out of my expertise here, but I think there already are some, and then if the legislation being developed right now is completed, then there should be way more.
Is there a reason why Dominion Power has not been mentioned here over the past hour?
Because you didn't bring them up.
I'm sorry, I was waiting. I think maybe we're scared to bring the name up, but I think Dominion Power would help with a whole lot of this work, don't you think?
Okay, which ones, where do you see them helping?
In funding all across the board, up and down the chart? On the commercial
They make money.
I know. They hate it. But they got some pull. Everybody was too scared to even mention them here over the past hour. I'm wiping up the blood from biting my tongue too long.
Well, Bill, you should have brought it up a lot sooner. Do you have specific suggestions on where they could be included as an implementation partner, and what exactly you're thinking of in terms of funding and financing? I mean, they have certain rebates on electric vehicles. You know, I'm if you know of things, please tell me, and I'll add that in.
I just know that I work with Dominion Power as they relate to the residential sector, and I've seen where like they brought in Honeywell and Siemens and another group, you know, in the commercial sector, commercial private. Now this is commercial public sector.
Right.
You've got the best minds in the business here. I'm looking at down at the bottom chart here, but I know for a fact that Dominion Power wants to be involved in every one of these issues. You know, nothing specific do I have? No, but you know, in general, I would call them on every issue that you're looking at.
So I would say getting building solar EV chargers and solar
efficiency, you know, state of the art HVAC, you know, electric retrofit. Oh, come on. That's what they live for.
Okay, then this last one, phase out fossil fuel dependence in all city agreements and contracts by giving preference to companies that reduce the city's energy footprint. Let's see. So, oops. Some of the notes that came up before. Change in city policies. So identify citywide procurement that would benefit instead of create another administrative hurdle. Include green energy in all RFP scoring. Wait more, give preference to those bidders that can provide evidence of or information on their green components and practices for all procurements at a certain threshold. And then we needed to define a date by which this will happen. So I think those are some good next steps, actually. What do you think? Ongoing, ready to go, align, city action, state action?
City action. And I think your first step in that is you need a city energy manager to be the person who's assessing this, because DPS does not have that. You know, where else, who signs the thing, who stamps the thing at the end of the day? But I'm sorry, excuse me, don't say that. That person could give you insight as to, okay, what kind of procurements would raise a review, where to even start. Because what you don't want to do is say every procurement needs to go through this process, because that's just going to add more lag time to everything that we do.
Okay. Any other next steps? How about implementation partners?
For private sector, the vendors themselves.
Can you think of equity gaps in this? Giving preference to companies that reduce the city's energy footprint. How could we address equity gaps?
That one might be similar to what Michael said earlier, that there's not, it's a global view if we're considering greenhouse gas reduction.
All right, well, we're just about out of time. Any other funding or financing thoughts on this one?
See city manager position. A city energy manager position.
All right, any other thoughts? While we're waiting for the other group to come back, the next one that we're not getting to is municipal climate impact mapping. Establish a protocol for tracking greenhouse gas emissions and planning for climate impacts. And then that first subcomponent is create a departmental greenhouse gas tracking protocol to identify reduction opportunities and publicize KPIs quarterly. Incorporate data and equity into performance-based budgeting. Someone from the public suggested that we report emissions by neighborhood as possible. And relevant legislation might include Virginia Energy Plan with an inventory for greenhouse gas emissions using a method determined by DEQ for the 4 years prior to the issuance of the plan. Any thoughts on readiness? We burnt out?
Would that be ongoing since you've already got energy cap on a roll? And then you have a position in the wings to implement?
How about a line? I think it's ready to go. We don't have a protocol though. Like, I would call our protocol like that there isn't one and there needs to be one. So I'm going to say ready to go.
That's what you're talking about. You have all the gas data, but you don't have the departmental data necessarily.
Yeah. Okay.
John, we're rejoining you because we have 6 minutes left. So
Yep.
okay.
Well, we were waiting for you to come back. I think
Oh, okay. We didn't get a
we're
notice.
pretty
to come
burnt
back.
out ourselves. So
Okay.
how'd that go?
We made some progress, I think. Yeah. We made some.
Definitely.
It's hard work.
It
really
is.
is. So we're just really grateful that you guys are helping us think this through, because this is where it gets tricky. So our next meeting is going to be Wednesday, August 4th at 11. We're going to continue this. If you have any suggestions on how to do this differently or better, please let us know. We have another meeting, a new meeting that we're going to be sending an invitation out for Wednesday, August 25th at 11. And hopefully we'll be able to get through the rest of these strategies at the August 4 meeting. So then at the end of the summer, we'll be able to talk about the accountability and transparency piece of it. So there's a survey in the link for you to let us know what you thought about this. If you have any suggestions, please let us know. There's also going to be an RVA Greener survey. David, or I think Kendra had to leave. Does anyone else from our team have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I can share what I know. So Kendra Norell is going to be sending out an email at the end of this week to all the working group members and roundtable members, just looking for information on how we can sort of spotlight, I think, your knowledge and your involvement moving forward. So that's just going to be, I think, basically some sort of a combination of an interest survey and a few other questions. So keep an eye out for that. I think she'll send it on Friday, she said. And that's going to, like I said, everyone.
Okay, great. Thanks. So that's a survey coming out later this week. Otherwise, this meeting is, we're done with what we wanted to accomplish today. So thank you so much for giving us your valuable time, especially over your lunch hour. So if you have any updates, anything upcoming that you'd like to share, feel free to use the chat or go back to that slide at the beginning of the presentation and enter it there, and we'll share it with the group. Otherwise, the floor is yours, and I'll hang on for a few more minutes if anyone wants to stick around. But thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.
Bye.